walked into Christmas dinner wearing my navy dress whites, carrying deployment orders, and the Medal of Valor I'd earned, saving 17 sailors during a typhoon. But when I entered the dining room, my Aunt Carol stood up and announced to the entire family, "There she goes again, putting the military before family. You've officially ruined Christmas, Lieutenant." 2 weeks later, Admiral Patricia Hawkins saluted me on the bridge of a destroyer and said, "Fleet Commander Martinez, you now have operational command of the Pacific Naval Task Force." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lieutenant Commander Elena Martinez, and if you've ever been told that your dreams were selfish, that your calling was inconvenient to other people's expectations, this story is for you. Growing up in San Diego, I was surrounded by navy blue uniforms and the sound of ships' horns echoing across the harbor. But in my family, military service was viewed as something that took you away from what really mattered: Sunday dinners, holiday traditions, and being present for every family milestone. My father, Miguel Martinez, managed a successful import business at the port of San Diego. My mother, Carmen, taught elementary school and believed that a woman's highest achievement was creating a stable home for her family. They had built a comfortable life in Coronado, complete with elaborate holiday celebrations that lasted for days, and family gatherings that everyone was expected to attend without exception. But it was my grandfather, Chief Petty Officer Roberto Boats Martinez, who understood the call of the sea. Every weekend, while other kids played video games or went to the mall, I spent my time at the harbor listening to his stories about life aboard destroyers and aircraft carriers. Grandpa Boats had served in the Gulf War, and his small apartment was filled with nautical charts, ship models, and photographs of crews from around the world. "Elena," he'd say, pointing to a model of the USS Nimitz on his mantelpiece, "the ocean doesn't care about your gender, your background, or your family's opinions. It only cares about your courage and your competence." He handed me a small sextant that had belonged to his father, who'd served in World War II. "If you ever decide to serve, this will help you find your way when everyone else thinks you're lost." That sextant became my compass. While my cousins planned quinceañeras and wedding themes, I dreamed of ship bridges and navigation charts. I threw myself into everything that would prepare me for naval service: swim team captain, physics and engineering courses, Sea Cadets program, and a 3.9 GPA. I studied naval history until I could recite the tactics of Admiral Nimitz and the lessons of Pearl Harbor. When I announced my intention to attend the Naval Academy, the family reaction was swift and unanimous. "Mija," my mother said, tears in her eyes, "why would you choose a life that keeps you away from us? You could be a teacher, a nurse, start a family. The military will steal the best years of your life." Dad was more direct. "Elena, you're throwing away your future for some romantic idea about serving your country. What about serving your family? What about being here for the moments that matter?" But Grandpa Boats believed in me. He spent hours helping me prepare for the academy entrance exams, teaching me seamanship fundamentals, and connecting me with retired officers who could write recommendation letters. When my acceptance letter to Annapolis arrived, he was the first person I called. "I knew you had salt water in your veins, kiddo," he said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. My family's reaction was different. They attended my academy graduation, but every conversation ended with hints about when I would finish playing sailor and come home to start a real life. At Annapolis, I found my purpose: the honor code, the seamanship, the brotherhood of officers. It all made sense. I graduated in the top 10% of my class, specializing in naval operations and emergency response procedures. My first assignment aboard the USS Charleston changed everything I thought I knew about proving myself. As a fresh ensign, I was assigned to the navigation department under Lieutenant Commander James Burke, an old-school officer who believed that women belonged on shore duty, not on the bridges of warships cutting through rough seas. For the first 6 months, Burke gave me routine tasks: updating charts that had already been verified, monitoring radio communications during quiet watches, and filing reports that rarely saw the light of day. But everything changed during a routine patrol mission in the South China Sea, when our primary navigation systems failed during a sudden storm. We were operating in contested waters, 70 miles off the coast of Taiwan, when lightning struck our main communications array. Our GPS went down, our radar was intermittent, and we were navigating blind in 12-foot swells with zero visibility. The bridge crew was struggling to maintain course, using backup systems that kept malfunctioning. That's when I remembered Grandpa Boat's lessons about celestial navigation. While the senior officers debated whether to call for emergency assistance, which would have revealed our position to potential hostile forces, I quietly pulled out the sextant he'd given me and began taking readings through brief breaks in the storm clouds. "Sir," I said to Lieutenant Commander Burke, "I can establish our position using celestial navigation. Give me 10 minutes and I can get us back on course." Burke looked at me like I'd suggested we navigate by throwing coins overboard. "Ensign Martinez, this is serious business. We need real solutions, not academy theory." But Captain Lisa Rodriguez, our commanding officer, overheard the exchange. "Ensign, show me what you've got." Using the sextant and nautical almanac I kept in my personal gear, I calculated our exact position within a quarter-mile margin of error. More importantly, I identified that we were drifting into a shipping lane that would put us on a collision course with commercial traffic. My calculations allowed us to adjust course and reach safe harbor without compromising our mission or revealing our location to hostile surveillance. The next morning, when our systems came back online, my celestial navigation proved to be more accurate than our electronic positioning had been before the storm. Captain Rodriguez called me into her quarters. "Ensign Martinez, that was exceptional seamanship. Where did you learn celestial navigation?" "My grandfather, ma'am. He said electronics fail, but the stars never lie." That incident earned me respect from the crew, but it also created an unexpected problem. Lieutenant Commander Burke began assigning me increasingly complex navigation challenges, seemingly hoping I would fail and prove that my success had been luck rather than skill. Instead, I excelled at every task. I developed new protocols for emergency navigation that reduced calculation time by 40%. I created backup systems for GPS failure that became standard procedure across our entire fleet group. I even discovered discrepancies in our official charts that had gone unnoticed for months. But when our patrol group was commended for exceptional navigation and seamanship, Lieutenant Commander Burke accepted the recognition at the awards ceremony. My innovations were credited to improved departmental procedures and enhanced training protocols. The pattern continued when we returned to port. I had designed a new watch rotation system that reduced crew fatigue and improved operational readiness by 25%. The system was so effective that other ships in our battle group requested implementation details. But when Admiral Harrison visited our ship to review the improvements, Burke presented the system as his own strategic initiative. "This is the result of experienced leadership and traditional Navy values," he told the Admiral while I stood in the background taking notes. I didn't protest. I told myself it was about the mission, about making our ship more effective and our crew safer. But I began documenting everything, every innovation, every improvement, every solution I developed during long watches when the senior officers were asleep. Because I was starting to realize that in the Navy, like everywhere else, your work could disappear into someone else's service record if you weren't careful to protect it. The betrayal came from someone I had learned to trust completely. Commander Rebecca Stone had been my mentor when I transferred to the USS Defender, the first officer who seemed genuinely committed to advancing women in naval leadership. She was everything I aspired to become: strategic, respected, and apparently dedicated to breaking through the barriers that kept women from reaching command positions. It started when Commander Stone assigned me to develop a comprehensive strategy for anti-submarine warfare in shallow coastal waters. This was cutting-edge naval doctrine in 2019, and the Pacific Fleet was desperately seeking new approaches to counter the growing submarine threats from hostile nations. Stone told me this was my opportunity to make a real impact, to create something that would establish me as a serious tactical thinker. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For 6 months, I immersed myself completely in the project. I studied submarine detection patterns, analyzed sonar data from dozens of encounters, and collaborated with acoustic specialists from the Naval Research Laboratory. I developed a revolutionary 3-layer detection system. that combined traditional sonar with underwater drones and surface vessels, working in coordinated patterns. The breakthrough came when I realized we'd been thinking about submarine detection all wrong. Instead of trying to track submarines directly, my system created acoustic nets that could detect the subtle water displacement patterns submarines created, even when running silent. It was like fishing with sound instead of trying to see the fish. Commander Stone reviewed my work with obvious excitement. "Elena, this is groundbreaking," she said, studying my tactical diagrams spread across her desk. "This could revolutionize how we approach submarine warfare. I want to present this to the Fleet Command myself." I was thrilled. Finally, someone would champion my work at the highest levels of naval leadership. 3 weeks later, I was reviewing morning intelligence reports when Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, our communications officer, approached me with a troubled expression. "Elena, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like hearing it," she said quietly. "Commander Stone just briefed the Admiral's staff about revolutionary anti-submarine warfare tactics." My stomach dropped. "That's wonderful. How did the briefing go?" Jennifer shook her head slowly. "She presented your entire detection system as her own innovation, called it the Stone Protocol. Your name wasn't mentioned once." The world seemed to shift beneath my feet. "That's impossible, Jennifer. You must have misunderstood." I was there taking classified notes for the Admiral. Stone stood in that briefing room for 2 hours explaining, quote, her 3-layer system, her acoustic net concept, her revolutionary approach to shallow water submarine detection. She even used your exact technical terminology. I felt physically sick. 6 months of my most innovative thinking stolen and presented as someone else's genius. I marched to Commander Stone's quarters and knocked firmly. "Ma'am, I need to discuss the Admiral's briefing about anti-submarine warfare." Stone looked up from her computer with complete composure. "Ah, Lieutenant Martinez. Excellent work on the research support for that project. Your technical assistance was invaluable." "Technical assistance? Ma'am, that was my entire strategic framework. My concept, my research, my innovation." Her expression remained unchanged. "Lieutenant, you need to understand how the Navy works. Junior officers contribute research to senior officers' strategic initiatives. That's how knowledge moves up the command structure. I refined your ideas, added operational context, and presented them at a level appropriate for Fleet Command. You stole my work." Stone's demeanor hardened. "I mentored you through a complex project and gave you invaluable strategic experience. That system wouldn't exist without my guidance and oversight. Besides, who do you think the Admiral would rather hear from? A lieutenant with 2 years of experience, or a commander with 15 years of proven naval leadership?" I stood there speechless, realizing my mentor had been grooming me not for advancement but for exploitation. "I suggest you focus on your next assignment and remember that teamwork, not individual ambition, builds naval careers." That night I called home desperately seeking support, someone to validate my anger. Instead, my mother sighed heavily. "Mija, this is exactly why I worried about the military. It's a man's world where your contributions don't matter." The Stone incident wasn't an isolated betrayal. It was the beginning of a systematic pattern that made me question everything I thought I understood about naval advancement. Over the next 2 years, I watched the same cycle repeat itself with devastating consistency. It started subtly. My tactical assessments would disappear from secure databases, only to reappear as fleet-wide strategic improvements credited to senior officers. My innovative training exercises were implemented across multiple ships but attributed to, quote, collaborative departmental efforts, rather than their actual designer. When I raised concerns, I was reminded that individual recognition was less important than fleet effectiveness. Then came Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, fresh from a Pentagon staff assignment with a master's degree in international relations and a father who happened to be a rear admiral. Webb was assigned to our destroyer group as my supposed peer, but within weeks, it became clear he was being positioned for accelerated advancement. The most blatant example occurred during Operation Pacific Shield, a joint naval exercise with Australian and Japanese forces near Guam. I had spent 4 months developing the coordination protocols, managing communications between 3 different navies, synchronizing weapon systems across varying technological platforms, and creating contingency plans for 15 different combat scenarios. The operation was so complex that officers from other ships came to study my organizational frameworks. Foreign naval officers specifically requested copies of my coordination matrices. The exercise ran flawlessly, with zero communication breakdowns and perfect tactical synchronization. But when it came time to present our findings to the Pacific Fleet Command, Captain Morrison chose Webb to lead the briefing. Lieutenant Commander Webb has excellent diplomatic skills, Morrison explained when I questioned the decision. This requires sophisticated international relations experience. I watched from the back of the command center as Webb presented my work to admirals from 3 nations. He stumbled through concepts he barely grasped, mispronounced Japanese naval terminology, and couldn't answer basic questions about the coordination systems I'd designed. Yet when the presentation ended, he was praised for his, quote, outstanding international cooperation capabilities. The following week, Webb was recommended for the Naval War College, a program I'd been trying to enter for 3 years. But the pattern extended beyond Webb. I began documenting how opportunities were distributed throughout our entire battle group. Male officers with mediocre performance evaluations were selected for high-profile assignments. Women with exceptional records were consistently assigned to support roles that never led to command positions. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had developed a damage control protocol that reduced emergency response time by 35%. The protocol was adopted fleet-wide under Commander Thompson's name. Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez created a new logistics system that improved supply efficiency by 40%. It became known as the Harrison Method after her male department head. I started protecting my work obsessively. I kept encrypted copies of my original reports, time-stamped my file submissions, and began sending myself classified emails detailing my contributions to various operations. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being strategic. The breaking point came when I was passed over for promotion to lieutenant commander for the 3rd time. My fitness reports were outstanding, my innovations were being used throughout the Pacific Fleet, and my leadership evaluations were exemplary. Yet I watched officers with half my accomplishments and none of my tactical expertise receive promotions. During my advancement review, Captain Morrison delivered the news with clinical detachment. Lieutenant Martinez, you're an excellent officer, but the promotion board felt you need more experience in collaborative leadership. Your recent tendency to assert individual ownership over projects concerns them. Sir, what specific collaborative leadership deficiencies am I demonstrating? Well, for instance, your insistence on maintaining detailed records of your contributions. The Navy values team players, not officers who seem focused on personal recognition. I realized my competence had become a liability. Every innovation I created, every problem I solved, every operational improvement I designed, was being used as evidence against me. I was too effective at my job, and that made other people uncomfortable. That night, I made a decision that would alter my entire career trajectory. I would stop feeding the system that was consuming my work. Instead, I would begin building recognition that couldn't be stolen or reassigned. Anaktati te Esifori reassigned. The call came at 0430 hours on a gray December morning while I was standing watch on the bridge of the USS Defender. The voice belonged to my mother, but it carried a weight I'd never heard before. Elena, you need to come home immediately. Grandpa Boats collapsed at the harbor. The doctors say his heart is failing. I caught emergency leave and flew from Pearl Harbor to San Diego, still wearing my working uniform, clutching the sextant he'd given me 15 years earlier. By the time I reached Sharp Memorial Hospital, Grandpa Boats was conscious but fragile, connected to monitors that beeped steadily in the sterile room. I sat beside his bed for 2 days, holding his weathered hands and telling him about my career, about the innovations I'd created, about the battles I was fighting that had nothing to do with foreign adversaries. On the second evening, his eyes focused with sudden clarity. He couldn't speak well, but he pointed to the bedside drawer and mouthed, "For you." Inside was a thick manila envelope with my name written in his careful script, along with something that made my breath catch, his original naval commission from 1973, and a faded photograph of him receiving the Navy Cross for actions during a rescue operation. But it was the letter that changed everything. "My dearest Elena," it began, dated just 2 months earlier. "If you're reading this, then I'm probably anchored in whatever harbor they assign old sailors in the next life. I've been following your career more closely than you know, and I need you to understand something that no one else has had the courage to tell you. You're not just a good naval officer, you're a revolutionary one. I've been making calls, using connections from my 40 years of service, asking questions about your work. Do you know that your anti-submarine protocols are being studied at the Naval War College? That your coordination systems have been requested by NATO allies? That tactical officers across 3 fleets have implemented your emergency procedures? You've been creating waves that are changing how the Navy operates, even when the people around you refuse to acknowledge it. But I also know about Stone, about Webb, about all the ways they've tried to diminish your contributions. I've seen this before, granddaughter. During my time, they did it to Hispanic sailors, to anyone who didn't fit their narrow idea of naval leadership. Don't let them sink your spirit. Don't let them convince you that their limitations define your horizon. You have something they fear, the ability to see solutions they can't imagine, and the courage to implement them under pressure. Protect that gift. Document everything. Build your own fleet of allies. And when the moment comes, and you'll recognize it when it arrives, don't wait for permission to command." The letter ended with coordinates written in his precise navigation style. I recognized the game immediately, our old treasure hunts from childhood. I entered the coordinates into my phone and discovered they led to a storage facility near the naval base. Inside that storage unit was a filing cabinet containing 30 years of Grandpa Boat's correspondence with naval officers, defense analysts, and maritime policy experts. He'd been quietly advocating for my work, sharing copies of my published articles with people who mattered, building a network of supporters I never knew existed. At the bottom of the cabinet was a folder labeled Elena's Command. Inside were letters of recommendation from admirals I'd never met, invitations to speak at naval conferences I'd never heard of, and an application to the Naval War College, completely filled out, except for my signature. Grandpa Boats died peacefully the next morning, just as the sun was rising over San Diego Bay. At his funeral, officers in dress whites I'd never seen before approached me with stories about his pride in my career and comments about my, quote, groundbreaking work in naval tactics. I realized he'd been fighting a parallel campaign for my advancement while I'd been fighting alone on the front lines. Standing at his graveside, wearing my dress blues while my family stood uncomfortably nearby, I made a decision. I would stop waiting for the system to recognize me. I would apply for that War College position, attend those conferences, and build the naval career Grandpa Boats knew I was destined for. The moment that changed everything happened 3 weeks after Grandpa Boats' funeral, during what was supposed to be our family's traditional Christmas celebration. I had just received my acceptance letter to the Naval War College, the same program that had rejected me twice before Grandpa's network of allies intervened. I also carried emergency deployment orders that had arrived that morning, along with the Medal of Valor I'd received for saving 17 sailors during Typhoon Malaccas. I walked into our family home in Coronado wearing my Navy dress whites, hoping this time my family might finally understand that my service meant something beyond their disappointment. The house was filled with 3 generations of Martinez family members, all gathered around our traditional Christmas Eve feast that had been a family institution for 20 years. The dining room buzzed with conversation about Cousin Maria's new teaching job, Uncle Carlos's promotion at the Port Authority, and my brother's recent engagement. When I entered the room, the chatter gradually died as everyone noticed my uniform. My Aunt Carol, the family's self-appointed keeper of traditions, stood up from her seat at the head of the table. Her face was flushed with wine and indignation. "There she goes again," Carol announced to the entire room, her voice carrying that mixture of disappointment and anger I'd heard my entire life. "Putting the military before family? We planned this dinner around your leave schedule, Elena, and now you're leaving us again for some Navy emergency. You've officially ruined Christmas." The room fell silent. I could feel every eye on me, see the nodding heads that agreed with her assessment. But something inside me shifted, not into anger, but into absolute clarity. "Actually, Carol, I need to share something with all of you." I pulled out my phone and opened the email that had arrived 6 hours earlier. The subject line read, "Classified, Pacific Fleet Emergency Operations Command." "Those deployment orders aren't for some routine assignment," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I've been selected to lead the emergency response to a crisis in the South China Sea. Apparently, the Pacific Fleet wants me to coordinate a multi-ship rescue operation because of my expertise in emergency maritime tactics." The room went dead quiet. I could see my father's confused expression, my mother's dawning realization that she didn't understand what I actually did for the Navy. But I wasn't finished. I opened my laptop and pulled up a presentation I'd been preparing for the War College application. "Since we're all here, let me show you what playing sailor actually means." For the next 20 minutes, I walked them through my naval career accomplishments. The anti-submarine protocols now protecting shipping lanes across the Pacific. The coordination systems that had prevented 3 international incidents. The emergency procedures that were being taught at naval academies as required curriculum. I showed them screenshots of commendations from Allied naval commanders, letters from Pentagon officials, and articles from Naval Institute publications featuring my tactical innovations. I displayed my security clearance level, my classified project portfolio, and the Medal of Valor citation describing how I'd risked my life to save my shipmates during a Category 4 typhoon. When I finished, my uncle Roberto, a longshoreman who'd worked the docks for 30 years, broke the silence. "Elena, are you telling us you're some kind of naval tactical expert, that the Navy actually listens to your strategies?" I looked directly at Carol. "The Pacific Fleet didn't call me away from Christmas dinner, Carol. They called me to command a critical operation because 17 sailors are alive today because of decisions I made during a storm that would have killed them." The room remained silent as I packed up my laptop. "So you're right about one thing. I am putting the military first today. Because somewhere in the South China Sea there are sailors who need someone who knows how to bring them home safely." I looked around the table one final time. "Merry Christmas, everyone. I hope you understand now that this isn't about choosing the Navy over family. It's about accepting that some responsibilities are bigger than dinner plans." 2 weeks later, my phone rang with an admiral's direct line. "Lieutenant Commander Martinez. This is Admiral Patricia Hawkins, Pacific Fleet Operations. You've been selected to lead Task Force 7 in response to the merchant vessel crisis near the Spratly Islands. Can you be aboard the USS Resolute by 0800 tomorrow?" The call should have been the validation of everything I'd worked toward. Instead, it became the beginning of the most challenging period of my naval career. Because commanding at the highest levels comes with enemies who want to see you fail. The moment my emergency appointment was announced, the retaliation began swift and systematic. Captain Morrison, who had spent years minimizing my contributions, called me into his quarters with an expression I'd never seen before: cold calculation mixed with barely contained resentment. "Martinez, I don't know what political maneuvering got you this assignment, but leading a task force is far beyond your experience level. This kind of rapid advancement raises serious questions about your fitness for command." "Sir, I was selected based on my emergency response protocols and coordination expertise. Protocols developed using fleet resources that should have been credited to department leadership," he said, leaning forward. "I've been reviewing your service record, and there are concerning patterns of insubordination and failure to follow proper chain of command procedures." I realized he was constructing a case against me. Every time I'd protected my innovations from theft, every article I'd published without going through proper channels, every conference where I'd presented my own work, it was all being reframed as evidence of poor naval discipline. "Sir, are you questioning my readiness for this command?" "I'm documenting my concerns for Admiral Hawkins. The Navy values officers who understand teamwork. Lieutenant Commander Martinez. Lone operators don't succeed in fleet command." Over the next week, my life became a bureaucratic gauntlet. Morrison subjected me to additional psychological evaluations, questioned my security clearance, and delayed my transfer orders. Meanwhile, I discovered that Commander Stone had been spreading rumors about my erratic behavior and tendency toward reckless decision-making. The most devastating blow came when Lieutenant Commander Webb was suddenly assigned as my, quote, deputy commander for the task force operation. Despite having no experience in emergency maritime operations and minimal understanding of multi-ship coordination, Webb would be joining me to provide, quote, strategic balance to my tactical approach. I spent sleepless nights preparing for an operation that could be undermined by someone who couldn't distinguish between a destroyer and a cruiser on radar. But the real challenge wasn't Webb, it was the isolation. Officers who had previously been collegial became distant. Colleagues stopped including me in informal planning sessions. I was being systematically excluded from the networks that make naval careers possible. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, the communications officer whose logistics innovations had been stolen by her department head, approached me at the officers' club. "Elena, I know what they're doing to you," she said quietly. "The same thing they did to me, just not as publicly. But I want you to know, there are others of us watching. Women officers who've had our work appropriated, our contributions minimized, our commands questioned." She handed me a secure communication device. "These are encrypted contact codes for officers across the Pacific Fleet who've experienced similar treatment. We've been documenting, sharing intelligence, building our own support network." That device contained contact information for 18 women officers across different ships, different ranks, different specialties. All of them had experienced systematic undermining of their careers. All of them had been fighting the same battles I was fighting, individually and in silence. For the first time since the Admiral's call, I didn't feel alone. "Jennifer, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time we stopped fighting these battles separately. You're going into command with visibility none of us have ever had. If you succeed, if you prove that competence matters more than politics, it changes the game for all of us. And if I fail? Then we'll still be here, ready to support the next woman who gets her shot." I looked at those 18 names and realized I wasn't just commanding a task force. I was carrying the hopes of every woman officer who'd been told she wasn't strategic enough, experienced enough, or command material enough for fleet leadership. The bridge of the USS Resolute felt like the center of the world as I took command of Task Force 7. 3 destroyers, 2 frigates, and a hospital ship spread across 12 nautical miles of contested waters near the Spratly Islands, where a massive cargo vessel had suffered catastrophic engine failure with 847 crew members aboard. Lieutenant Commander Webb stood beside me at the command station, nervously checking his communication protocols and struggling to follow the rapid-fire coordination happening around us. But I was no longer concerned about his presence undermining the operation. I had something more powerful than his political connections. I had the expertise to save lives. The situation was more complex than anyone in Washington had anticipated. The disabled cargo ship was drifting toward a reef system in international waters claimed by 3 different nations. Chinese naval vessels were approaching from the north, Vietnamese patrol boats from the west, and a typhoon was building strength 200 miles to the southeast. "Ma'am," my communications officer reported, "the Chinese are demanding we withdraw from their territorial waters. The Vietnamese are claiming salvage rights. And weather reports show the storm intensifying to Category 2. I studied the tactical display, calculating wind speeds, drift patterns, and the political implications of every decision. This wasn't just a rescue operation, it was a test of whether the U.S. Navy could execute complex humanitarian missions without triggering international incidents. "All ships, this is Task Force 7 Actual," I announced over the Fleet Communication Network. "We're implementing Emergency Protocol 7 Alpha. Hospital ship advances to rescue position. Destroyers establish defensive perimeter. Frigates coordinate with civilian rescue vessels." The protocol I'd developed during my years of being overlooked was now being executed by 6 warships in front of international observers. Every coordination system, every communication procedure, every tactical decision I'd refined in secret, was being demonstrated under the most intense scrutiny possible. But the moment that defined the operation came when the Typhoon's outer bands reached us ahead of schedule. 40-knot winds and 12-foot swells turned the rescue into a nightmare scenario. The cargo ship was taking on water, listing dangerously, and would capsize within hours. "Ma'am," Webb said, his voice shaking, "shouldn't we request additional support from Pearl Harbor? This is beyond our operational parameters." "Lieutenant Commander," I replied calmly, We are the additional support. Execute emergency evacuation procedures now. For the next 8 hours, I orchestrated the most complex maritime rescue in Pacific Fleet history. Using my coordination matrices, we evacuated 847 crew members in heavy seas while maintaining diplomatic communications with 3 hostile naval forces and preparing for storm force winds. The breakthrough moment came when Chinese Admiral Chen, monitoring our operations, opened direct communication with our task force. U.S. Commander, your rescue coordination is exceptional. Chinese Navy offers assistance with medical evacuation. By dawn, every crew member had been rescued, the cargo vessel had been safely towed to international waters, and we'd managed the operation without a single diplomatic incident. The typhoon passed harmlessly to the south. The validation came immediately. Fleet Command received commendations from 5 allied nations. The State Department called it, quote, exemplary humanitarian leadership under extreme conditions. The operation became a case study at the Naval War College within 3 months. But the real success was systemic. Admiral Hawkins promoted 3 women officers from my network based on tactical innovations they'd implemented during the operation. The Pacific Fleet created a new rapid response protocol based entirely on my coordination systems. Most importantly, Webb submitted an official report crediting my leadership as, quote, the gold standard for maritime crisis management. 6 months later, when the Navy announced the formation of a new Strategic Maritime Command, my name was the only one under consideration for leadership. The network of women officers that Jennifer had connected me with began receiving assignments to critical positions across the fleet. For the first time in Navy history, competence was being recognized regardless of gender or political connections. The girl who'd been told she was ruining Christmas by choosing duty over dinner plans was now setting the standard for how the modern Navy responds to international crises. The call came 8 months after the Spratly Islands operation, just as I was reviewing fleet readiness reports in my new office at Pacific Fleet Command. The voice on the other end was familiar but carried a weight I'd never heard before. It was my father. Elena, your mother and I have been talking about what happened at Christmas dinner, about everything we said. We think we owe you more than an apology. His voice broke slightly. We'd like to come visit you in Hawaii, if you're willing to see us. There are things we need to understand about what you do, about who you've become. 3 days later, I met them at Honolulu International Airport. Dad looked older, more uncertain of himself. Mom walked beside him, carrying a thick folder against her chest like a shield. But it was what Dad wore that surprised me most. A small Navy anchor pin on his shirt collar, the kind military families wear to show pride in their service member. We drove to my quarters at Pearl Harbor in careful silence, 20 years of misunderstanding filling the rental car. Once we were seated in my living room, Dad looked around at the commendations covering my walls, the photos of me with admirals and foreign naval officers, the classified briefing materials stacked on my desk. Elena, he began, his voice unsteady, I owe you an apology that should have come years ago. Mom opened her folder and pulled out newspaper clippings, printed articles, and official Navy press releases. After Christmas dinner, we realized we had no idea what you actually do, she said quietly. So we started researching. We called the Navy Public Affairs Office. We talked to other military families. Dad picked up a copy of Naval Institute Proceedings with my photograph on the cover. I learned that you're not just a naval officer, Elena. You're considered one of the most innovative tactical commanders in the Pacific Fleet, that your rescue operations have saved hundreds of lives. I also learned something else, he continued, meeting my eyes for the first time in years. I learned that the Navy's salary for a strategic maritime commander is significantly higher than anything I ever made managing import logistics. Despite everything, I almost smiled. Of course, Dad would finally understand success in financial terms. But that's not why I'm here apologizing, he said quickly. I'm here because I finally understand what I was too stubborn to see. You weren't abandoning family responsibilities. You were accepting responsibilities. I was too small-minded to comprehend. Mom leaned forward. Elena, we attended a Navy family support meeting last month. They had a guest speaker, a retired admiral who talked about women in maritime leadership. She specifically mentioned your Spratly Islands operation, called it the future of naval crisis management. We sat there realizing our daughter was the person she was praising, and we'd spent years making you feel guilty for serving. The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd ever had. Dad admitted that his criticism of my career had been rooted in fear that he couldn't understand my world, fear that I was growing beyond his ability to relate to me, and fear that my achievements highlighted his own limitations. "I spent so many years trying to convince you to choose a path I could understand," he said. "I never considered that maybe I should try to understand the path you'd chosen." Mom pulled out one final document from her folder, an official invitation addressed to our family. "This came to our house last week," she said. "It's from the Secretary of the Navy, inviting us to a ceremony where you're receiving the Navy Distinguished Service Medal." I looked at the invitation. I hadn't told them about the ceremony because I'd assumed they wouldn't be interested. "We'd like to attend," Dad said, "if you'll have us. And Elena. I want to learn about what you do. Not because I finally approve, but because I want to understand the daughter I should have been proud of all along." For the first time in my life, when Dad introduced me to people, it wasn't with embarrassment or resignation. It was with the kind of pride that comes from finally recognizing excellence, even when it appears in forms you never expected to understand. 1 year later, I stood on the bridge of the USS Enterprise, looking out at the most diverse fleet formation in Pacific naval history. The occasion was the commissioning of Task Force Pacific, the new rapid response command I'd been selected to lead as the youngest fleet commander in modern Navy history. In the harbor below, my parents sat in the VIP section wearing navy blue for the first time in their lives, both sporting small anchor pins and beaming with a pride that had taken decades to develop. Next to them was Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Walsh, recently promoted and now serving as my deputy operations officer. Behind them were dozens of women officers, whose careers had flourished under the new merit-based advancement system we'd implemented together. But it was the young woman standing at attention on the quarterdeck who captured my attention most completely. Ensign Isabella Santos, fresh from the Naval Academy, held a small notebook and watched every detail of the ceremony with the same intensity I'd shown 20 years earlier. She reminded me of myself at that age, brilliant, determined, and completely unaware that her path would be fundamentally different from mine. 2 years ago, I began my address to the assembled fleet. I stood in a family dining room and was told that I had ruined Christmas by choosing duty over dinner plans. Not because I had failed in my responsibilities, but because the people I loved most couldn't understand that some responsibilities transcend family convenience. I paused, scanning the faces of sailors from 6 different ships. Today, I want to talk about what happens when you refuse to apologize for being excellent. I told them about Grandpa Boat's sextant, which now sat in my command quarters next to photos of me coordinating international rescue operations and designing maritime security protocols for allied nations. I spoke about the network of women officers who had supported each other through systematic career undermining and institutional bias. I explained how documenting our contributions and building independent recognition had created opportunities the traditional system would never have provided. But the real victory, I continued, isn't my promotion to fleet commander, or my appointment to the Joint Chiefs Advisory Board, or even the Presidential Unit Citation this task force received last month for preventing an international maritime crisis. I looked directly at Ensign Santos. The real victory is that tomorrow, a young woman will report to her first ship assignment in a Navy where her tactical innovations won't be stolen, where her leadership potential will be recognized, and where her path to command won't require her to fight the same battles we fought. After the ceremony, Ensign Santos approached me with nervous energy and determined eyes. "Commander Martinez, I've been developing some theories about integrating drone technology with submarine detection systems. My instructors say it's too advanced for a junior officer, but after hearing your story..." I smiled, remembering my own desperate attempts to share innovative ideas with officers who saw potential as a threat. "Ensign, advanced thinking is exactly what we need. Let's discuss it." Over the next hour, she outlined a strategy for using autonomous underwater vehicles to create acoustic monitoring networks in contested waters. Her thinking was sophisticated, original, and exactly the kind of innovation the Navy needed from its newest officers. "Ensign Santos, I'm assigning you to the Strategic Innovation Department. Your drone detection proposal will be fast-tracked for development and properly credited to you." 6 months later, Ensign Santos's system was being tested across the Pacific Fleet. She was promoted ahead of schedule and selected for the Advanced Tactical Training Program. Her success became another example of what was possible when competence was valued over politics. The story that began with a compass and a grandfather's faith in my potential had become something larger than either of us imagined. It became proof that when you refuse to accept limitations others place on you, you don't just change your own course, you chart new waters for everyone who follows. Every time a young woman officer receives command recognition, every time tactical innovation is credited to its actual creator, every time the system chooses merit over tradition, Grandpa Boats' sextant continues pointing toward true north. That direction is always toward excellence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.